Gaza, hostages freed, prisoners exchanged, and the promise of a new era. Sometimes the world needs to hit rock bottom to finally look up. That's what happened when cameras captured the improbable. Hostages being freed, prisoners being exchanged, and enemies, for a moment, seeming to speak the same language. Headlines called it a new era, but no one could say for sure if it was the beginning of peace or just the intermission between two wars. The paradox was clear. The same act that brought tears of joy to some brought fear and distrust to others. After all, when politics and compassion collide, who truly wins? Trump appeared on global television declaring that the war is over. But is it really over? Behind the scenes, generals scratched their heads, diplomats whispered, and the feeling that something bigger was coming hung in the air. The promise of an era of peace sounded too beautiful to be true. And let's face it, the world has seen this movie before. From treaties that turned to ashes to speeches that concealed intentions, history has taught us that not every truce means rest. Sometimes, it's just the time needed to prepare the next move. And that's precisely where the mystery behind this new chapter begins. What lies behind the diplomatic smiles and the handshakes in front of the cameras? What no one saw and what no one wanted to tell. In this analysis, we delve beyond the headlines, into the shadows of the negotiations, into the voices of those who suffered, and into the promises that can change the fate of a generation. Because in the end, true peace never begins in palaces. It begins in silence, and in what the world decides to do after it. The exchange that stopped the world, it was one of those moments when the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. Television channels broadcast live, crowds gathered in front of their screens, and for a brief moment, war gave way to hope. The announcement of the hostage release and the prisoner exchange between Israel and Hamas wasn't just news. It was a symbolic, almost biblical event. Amid decades of hatred and revenge, seeing people returned alive to their families' arms sparked a rare feeling of shared humanity. Behind the scenes, however, the situation was far more complex than the excitement on the streets. This seemingly simple operation involved weeks of negotiations, blackmail, and silent promises between rival powers. The United States, Egypt, and Qatar acted as mediators, balancing every word and every gesture, like someone wielding lit dynamite. Trump, watching everything with an eagle eye, was already preparing a speech about the beginning of a new era, while generals feared this truce was just the prelude to something much bigger. And as planes landed and buses crossed borders, the feeling was paradoxical. Victory and distrust walked side by side. Some saw the agreement as a political miracle, others as a cold-blooded move disguised as compassion. On social media, photos of reunions were moving, but in private meetings the tone was different. "This changes everything," they said. And indeed it would. For in the shadows of this humanitarian gesture, the real battle was beginning to unfold. The diplomatic one. Negotiations in the shadows, while the world celebrated the images of embraces and tears. Behind the scenes, the reality was constant tension. The negotiations that led to the hostage release and prisoner exchange didn't take place at gilded tables or under camera lights, but in stuffy, windowless rooms filled with suspicious eyes. Every word carried the weight of a bomb about to explode. Egyptian diplomats, Qatari agents, and American advisors worked through the night, putting out fires before they even became public. Silence was the rule. Any leak could turn a delicate agreement into a new conflict. Trump, who closely followed everything, knew that the secret to power lies in timing. He didn't speak much, but he made a point of being present at decisive moments, like a maestro conducting an invisible concert. His aides described him as a chess player at war, calculating, patient, but willing to sacrifice pieces if the political checkmate was worth it. On the other side, Netanyahu balanced internal pressure and diplomatic fragility, trying to show strength without breaking the fragile thread of the truce. It was a shadow theater, where every gesture had a hidden purpose. And between each signed agreement, one truth became clear. What was seen on television was just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay veiled promises, exchanges of information, economic concessions, and even pacts of silence between historic enemies. It was politics at its rawest, where good and evil blur, and morality adapts to circumstances. And in this silent game, something even greater was born. The embryo of an unlikely alliance, shaped not by ideals, but by convenience. Voices of suffering. The gates opened, but not everyone returned unharmed. Amidst hugs and tears, there were also lost, empty looks that seemed to carry the weight of an entire world. The freed hostages spoke little, and when they did, their words were filled with pauses, with silences that said more than any speech. Some described the constant sound of explosions, the fear of falling asleep, the time that seemed to melt away into sunless days. Others preferred to remain silent, as if words could awaken still dormant ghosts. Freedom in this context was a partial return. The body returned, but the mind remained trapped there. On the other side, in Israeli prisons, similar stories were repeated. Young people leaving after years of incarceration found a world they no longer recognized. Aging parents, grown children, streets transformed into fields of distrust. The reunion was always bittersweet. There was celebration, but also the discomfort of what could not be said. One former Palestinian prisoner recounted that the sound of the iron doors slamming still echoed in his dreams. The exchange, for many, did not erase the past. It merely repackaged it with new fears. And amidst it all, a collective feeling hung in the air. The feeling that pain was the only truly common language among these people. Reporters were moved, psychologists rushed to offer support, and religious leaders spoke of forgiveness. But they knew healing would not come quickly. The trauma left invisible traces, shaping an entire generation that learned to distrust even hope. And perhaps, it was precisely in this mixture of relief and pain that a new narrative began to emerge. One that, ironically, would depend more on politics than on true peace. The political stage behind peace. While the world was thrilled by the reunions, behind the scenes, leaders were already calculating the political dividends of the operation. Trump appeared before the cameras with the look of someone who knew exactly the symbolic weight of that moment. He spoke of a new era, restoration of dignity, and victory of diplomacy, while his strategists were already working to transform the humanitarian act into electoral capital. It was a sharp, meticulously rehearsed speech that blended compassion and power, hope and dominance. Across the ocean, Netanyahu also sought to reinforce his image as a firm leader, a man leading Israel amid chaos, even as, internally, his government faced fierce criticism. The truth is that every step of these negotiations had been planned with the precision of a chessboard. For Trump, the ceasefire and the release of the hostages were a way to reposition the United States as the guardian of global peace, something that served both foreign policy and domestic voters, tired of senseless wars. For Netanyahu, it was a chance to breathe politically, show concrete results, and divert attention from internal tensions. Both, in their own ways, sold the idea of redemption, a scarce and powerful commodity in times of disbelief. But behind the flashes and promises, there was a nagging feeling. Was peace being used as a bargaining chip? At conferences and debate programs, analysts questioned whether the truce was genuine or merely a carefully choreographed political performance. The streets of Jerusalem and Washington vibrated for different reasons. In one, they celebrated hope. In the other, the strengthening of power. And in the intertwining of these interests, an old and recurring dilemma emerged. When peace is used as a platform, who really wins the applause? The price of freedom. No agreement comes without a price, and in this case the price of freedom proved too high for some. While families celebrated the return of their loved ones, military personnel and security analysts looked with concern at the list of released prisoners. Among them were names linked to attacks, extremist cells, and movements considered dangerous. Negotiating with the enemy is opening a door that never completely closes, said a former Israeli general. And he was right. Each freed hostage was a symbol of victory. but also a reminder that the fragility of peace could be exploited at any moment. The moral dilemma hung like a thick cloud over the Middle East. How to balance compassion and prudence. How to celebrate without ignoring the risks. Some religious leaders saw the exchange as a Christian gesture of forgiveness and renewal. Others as a strategic error disguised as kindness. In practice, the equation was cruel. Innocent lives returned home, but the fear of further kidnappings grew. In cafes, synagogues, and mosques, conversations revolved around the same question. How far is it worth negotiating with those who fuel conflict? And curiously, it was from this unease that new alliances began to emerge. Previously distant states began to draw closer, discussing ways to ensure the agreement wouldn't turn into another geopolitical trap. Security companies, diplomats, and even religious leaders mobilized to prevent a return to violence. It seemed, finally, that the world was learning, albeit belatedly, that all freedom has a price, and that the real challenge is not to conquer it, but to sustain it. And it was in this scenario, amidst promises and fears, that a new narrative began to take shape, that of reconstruction. The promise of a new era speeches echoed through the palaces and squares like hymns of rebirth. Leaders spoke of reconstruction, cooperation, and hope, while cameras captured weary yet curiously optimistic faces. The streets of Gaza, once gripped by fear, now showed timid signs of life. Children returning to school, markets reopening, families rebuilding their homes with what little remained. It was a portrait of a people who, even after everything, insisted on believing. "Maybe this time it will be different," said an elderly man when interviewed, and for a second it seemed that it might be. Behind the scenes, investments began to be promised. Trillion-dollar reconstruction plans, new energy alliances, and diplomatic agreements sprouted like seeds in devastated terrain. Trump called this phase the beginning of the era of pragmatic peace, while the world watched with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Israel spoke of security guarantees, and Hamas of sovereignty. The balance was fragile, sustained more by the exhaustion of conflict than by the conviction of peace. But even so, it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning is all a generation needs to believe again. And in the silence of the early morning hours in Gaza, amidst the rubble and the newly lit lights, something new seemed to emerge. A sense of pause, almost sacred, as if time had decided to give humanity a second chance. No one knew for sure what would come, whether the future would bring calm or a new storm, but the mere fact that there was hope was, in itself, a revolution. And while the next day's headlines spoke of a new era, in the hearts of ordinary people arose the question that would define tomorrow. Could peace, this time, be here to stay? The invisible cycle. What has really changed? After the celebrations and official speeches, the dust began to settle, and with it, uncomfortable questions arose. Had anything really changed? The same streets that had vibrated with the announcement of peace now lived with the shadow of drones in the sky and the silent fear of new offensives. In Gaza, every loud noise still sent children running. In Israel, sirens were still tested weekly. The promise of a new era sometimes seemed more like a collective hope than a political certainty. And the people, tired of being spectators, began to understand that perhaps true liberation would come not from the leaders, but from within. Trump continued with his speeches, Netanyahu with his calculations, and the world, true to its cycle, soon became distracted by another conflict, another crisis, another drama. The headlines changed, but the wounds remained raw. Still, something seemed different, albeit subtle. Global awareness of the cost of war had shifted. People began to question, to demand, to no longer so readily accept preconceived narratives. In cafes, universities, and social media, the topic of peace was once again debated not as a utopia, but as an urgent necessity. And perhaps that was the true legacy of this story, the awakening of a new collective perception. Because every time the world tires of chaos, it gives hope a second chance. And who knows, this small spark, born amid freed hostages, exchanged prisoners, and fragile promises, could be the beginning of a quiet revolution. After all, every era begins this way, not with fireworks but with a whisper. A reminder that peace, however unlikely it may seem, can still be the greatest act of courage of all. The echo of peace and the omen of the coming war. In the end, it all boils down to an uncomfortable truth. The world changes between the lines, not in the speeches. The press lights have dimmed, the leaders have returned to their palaces, and the promises echo in the wind. But in Gaza, there are still those who wake in the middle of the night afraid of the sound of planes. History teaches us that every truce carries within it the embryo of a new conflict, and that peace, when proclaimed too hastily, is often just a strategic pause. The problem is that almost no one realizes this until it's too late. The signs are always there, subtle, almost invisible, before the first bomb drops or the first fiery speech is delivered. They emerge in small political decisions, in routine military movements, in financial markets that tremble for no apparent reason. The world doesn't go to war overnight. It simply stops pretending to be at peace. And it is precisely at this point that the power of knowledge lies. Seeing before others is the difference between being caught up in the chaos or understanding the game before it begins. So if you want to understand what really happens before, from the headlines, download the free ebook now. 10 Signs That a War is About to Start. In it, you'll discover how to identify the signs that precede conflicts, economic manipulations, and political crises, those the news prefers not to comment on. It's more than reading, it's preparation. So click, dive into the content, and see for yourself what the world tries to hide. After all, those who understand the signs of chaos survive the storms of history.